How many minutes? Oh, we're fine.
I'll do that right now.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to make sure I got that in. You got your ethics forms and everything?
Oh, yeah.
I'm the only late one.
that week, but I forget.
I've been carrying it, so wrinkled, I've been carrying it.
I'll do that right
Yeah, no problem.
We're going to be on YouTube in a minute.
Oh, yeah. I did that one.
I've been carrying it, so wrinkled. I've been carrying it.
We're going to be on YouTube in a minute. I'll be stopping in 1 second.
Well, how's it going, Maggie? It's great. Good.
I just went down.
Oh, that's
great. Yeah, so I can go.
I know.
Hi, you were vaccinated.
All right, so we are on YouTube Live.
Oh.
If you want to check that, just make sure. So it works. And, that one. So,
Yes, and I know Mike is not coming. I'm not sure about Mark, but Mike Fleming is still in Florida. So we can start whenever you're ready, I'm sure.
and Jim is home. Joe, Jim is, I see he's logged on.
I told him he didn't have to come.
Well, he is here, so he's here with us.
Oh, good.
All right, so.
Okay. We all ready? Okay, welcome everyone to our April 7th work session. Would everyone please rise to the flag? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Have a roll call.
Mr. Acker. Mr. Izar. It's on the, here's. Dr. Kevin.
Here.
Mr. Fleming. Mr. Vidensky.
Here.
Mrs. Pusateri.
Here.
Olson.
Here.
Mrs. Tierney.
Here.
Mrs. Brashalski.
Here. So, okay. Okay. Dr. Mate, we have our superintendent's report.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Brashalski. Tonight, we are going to welcome Joseph Durkin, who is representing our Summit State Hospital regarding the project. Before we get to that, I just wanted to announce to the board that we are likely to experience early next week, a shortage of bus drivers, as many as 3 hospitals. Other schools have started. We have a driver who's not able to, so we are working to try to resolve the issue. Tomorrow, you'll have word out to everyone in the district, particularly those who may be affected. But we will be in the very unusual circumstance of potentially not being able to provide transportation to as many as 2 routes of students in the district. The companies are working on getting bus driver replacements. They have some training in the pipeline, but there is not, in our view, an immediate solution to this challenge of a desperate shortage of bus drivers in the district.
Is this just because of the COVID situation and not wanting coming back to work or retirements or what?
Bus drivers are short in the first place.
Right.
And we had been using drivers from other districts that were not in school.
Right.
And now we're learning that some of these other districts are reopening. Will then be, those drivers will be going back to where they originally began.
Okay.
So that's the challenge we face. And again, tomorrow morning, we're trying to combine routes and develop as many options to minimize the impact as much as we possibly can. It's a very serious thing. And tomorrow morning, we'll be getting word out to all those who are affected. And so I'm sorry to break that news to the board. Again, we're working to resolve it as best we can. And again, as information develops, we'll certainly be sending it out by email.
Would that be all grade levels?
It would be all grade levels because the routes, we have a 3-tier system, and the bus would typically start at the middle school and work its way through. And so there will be individuals affected K through 12 in the district.
More and more kids going in the buses, or are more parents still driving their
At
students to
at the
school?
high school and middle school levels, we see lower levels of ridership, but we still see high levels of ridership on particular routes at the elementary. So less than usual, but still our buses are certainly being utilized.
Thank you.
And so with that, we do have, again, Mr. Joseph Durkin joining us tonight. We've been in touch over the last several months about the prospect of a sewer plant at Clark Summit Hospital. Correct. And again, this is the next step in the process. And so we're grateful to have you tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I don't know, is the mic, I guess it is great. So by way of introduction, my name is Joe Durkin. I work for Riley Associates Engineers. Our main office is in Pittston. We have branch offices in Scranton and also up in Stroudsburg. Personally, I grew up in Clark's Green. So my 2 brothers and sisters all went to Abington Heights, and my mom used to teach in the middle school, one of the locations. And my brother used to play football right in the backyard over here. So I'm very familiar with the area. So we were hired, we're under contract by the Department of General Services. And we were initially hired to look at the wastewater treatment plant up at the Clark Summit State Hospital. And this has been, this particular plant has been under continuous study and concern for several years now. It's a very old plant, and it's reached to a point where there are newer environmental regulations coming into play on that plant, and it's gotten to the point where they need to either replace the plant or come up with some other solution for the wastewater treatment plant there. The reason you're involved is because that plant actually services wastewater from only 2 locations, from the Clark Summit State Hospital and also from the Abington Heights School District Middle School Elementary campus that's out there. Those are the only 2 users that currently go into that plant. So we completed a study earlier this year with General Services, and the conclusion of that study was that they are going to abandon that plant and demolish it and replace it with a sewage pumping station. And in the spirit of what's old again is new again, if I wind the clock back to when the middle school was first being built, the original proposal when that school was being built was for the school district to build its own pumping station and a force main and pump sewage along Newton Ransom Road out to Winola Road, past the pond, all the way up over the hill, and then down and connect into the collection system past Noble Road, past the senior high. And that's similar to the route that we're actually going to be pursuing. So the ultimate solution is that we're going to put in a pumping station at the location of the wastewater treatment plant, and we're going to build a new force main and pump that sewage basically on that same route, Newton Ransom Road, Winola Road, and then right past the pond, we're going to connect into the collection system. We don't need to go all the way down the hill to Noble Road, but we will connect in once we've gotten past sort of that flat area where the pond is. That sewage then continues on, flows down Winola Road, Electric Street, goes between the streets and eventually comes out down near Bedford Street and Center Street. goes down to the railroad tracks, runs along the railroad tracks, then goes down, comes over behind the shopping center, and then goes down 611 to the wastewater treatment plant. So the regional wastewater treatment plant, the ultimate disposal, is at the Abington Regional Wastewater Authority plant down in Chinchilla, ARWA, what is called ARWA. So
Do they utilize that now? Is that where it all ends up at that plant, or is this new to them?
this would be new to them. The current disposal is there is a trickling filter wastewater treatment plant right along Newton Ransom Boulevard, right across from the state hospital. If you head out that way before you get to the school, on the right-hand side, you'll see these big round tanks, and that's the location of the existing wastewater treatment plant. And that would be the location for the pumping station.
So the one down in Chinchilla, are they able to accept all this extra capacity?
Yes, yeah. I mean, in a broad sense, they probably service about 6,700 EDUs, and this site is about 172 EDUs. So just to put it in sort of numbers, an EDU, I'll start talking sewage. So when we talk sewage, we usually talk in terms of what are called EDUs, equivalent dwelling units, meaning a house. So when we equilibrate industrial or commercial or institutional uses, we always talk about them in terms of EDUs, sort of a standard unit. So between the hospital and the school, it's approximately 172 EDUs, or 60,000 gallons per day of flow. Right now, we are estimating that the school district is about a third of that, 20,000 gallons per day. And the hospital is about 40,000 gallons per day. So, and that flow basis is going to be something that going forward, we're going to confirm that, but that's based upon measurements of the actual flow, not water meter readings going into the school, but actual sewage flows coming out and entering the plant. So let me just back up and take 2 seconds to just take you through a little bit of the history so we understand how we got here. As I mentioned, the original plan was to build a pumping station and for the school to go on its own and pump into the Clark Summit collection system or into the South Abington collection system. That didn't happen. Eventually what happened was there was an agreement between Newton Township and the Department of General Services or General Services Administration for the state, GSA at that point, and the Department of Public Welfare, which ran the hospital. And that agreement allowed the school to be connected into that small plant that was there. That was in 1974. In 2001, that agreement was amended, and Abington Heights actually became a signatory of that agreement. And from that point forward, you were making direct payments to the state for your treatment, for use of the treatment plant. At this point, we are going to have to, because of the significant changes, we will wind up replacing all of those agreements. There will be agreements with all the parties that are involved, which is going to be Clark Summit Borough, South Abington Township, the Abington Regional Wastewater Authority, Newton Township, and the school district. That's the ultimate goal of the state in trying to rearrange this entire arrangement. Part of what
derailed it? Why are they saying it has to be done? Because the plant can't
right.
handle it anymore?
So correct. And what we were looking at was whether or not the plant could be upgraded or replaced in order to meet the current and the anticipated wastewater treatment effluent requirements that were coming online for that plant. And what we did is we did a cost analysis and an operating cost analysis for 5 different alternatives, several of which were rehabilitation and replacement of that plant with different types of technology. And one of them was this regional connection alternative. Within the regional connection alternative, we looked at 3 different connection scenarios of running a force main in the route that I talked about, another one going up West Grove Street and connecting in right past the library, and another route was coming up Country Club Road and connecting across the highway in the old salt company area. So that's we've looked at we've looked at 5 different alternatives, and we've looked at variations within those alternatives. We've costed out the construction cost and the operating cost, and we've done a present worth analysis on that. And the alternative of putting in the pumping station is substantially more cost effective than the replacement and operation of a wastewater treatment plant, along the order of magnitude of, I think it was $8.3 million versus 5.7 million. Again, those aren't construction dollars, those are present worth dollars over a 20-year period. But a substantial, not a 2-to-1, but a substantial difference between the lowest cost alternative and the pumping station alternative. Besides just the cost factors, there's also environmental considerations. And that is that the state does not want to be in the wastewater treatment business. This is something that is happening across the entire Commonwealth. We've been involved in several of these facilities where the state has gotten out of doing wastewater treatment and has connected into a regional facility. The regional facilities have access to larger training programs. They've got access to their own laboratories. There's a lot more sophistication in terms of running the processes, which are not available when you're trying to run a small plant. So there, on top of the cost reasons, there's also environmental and safety reasons that would favor this alternative. Sure.
How is Clark Summit State Hospital handling this situation?
So the hospital already has funding for this. So they are through the capital appropriations, they already have an allocation for all of their funding for this. So what we are tasked with right now, Riley Associates, is we are going around and we've, as Dr. Mann said, we've already had several discussions with all the involved parties. And what Department of General Services has asked us, could we go back to all these entities, and we would like to ask them to basically pass a motion of support for the project. Because what we don't want to do is wind up 6 months or 9 months down the road and have somebody raise their hand, South Abington, Clark Summit, Arwa, and say, we have a drop dead issue. There's no way we can go forward with this proposal. So we're approaching all those different entities in order to get them at this point just to say, yes, we have a broad understanding. We're not signing any agreements. We're not agreeing to do anything at this point, but we're indicating our understanding and our general support for this direction for the project. That will all have to be followed up with agreements and reviews. Obviously, I've said to you, we've estimated your flow and we've monitored it at 20,000 gallons per day. We need to show that information to your engineers. I talked about there being agreements. Those agreements are going to have to be looked at by your lawyers. And on all those costs, we want to capture, because the state wants to sign agreements with all the entities. Clark Summit Borough is going to have the same issue, South Abington Township, Arwa. So with all those different entities, before we get into the project, the state is going to sign agreements with everybody, basically saying your costs associated with managing this front end of the project will be reimbursed by them. It'll be incorporated into the project costs, so that Clark Summit Borough will not be paying out of pocket for anything in order to evaluate and accommodate the project.
And neither will the district?
That's correct.
So the hospital, you're saying they're signing out, they're doing the exact same thing? Or
Correct.
Their wastewater is going somewhere?
No, this project is going to take both the sewage from both of those entities. The wastewater treatment plant is going to be decommissioned. It will be either completely or mostly demolished, and I can touch on the reason for that in a second. But all the sewage from both of those entities will then be pumped out and connected into the regional facility. There is a possibility that a portion of the land that's adjacent to the hospital, there has been a developer who has approached Newton Township about developing that, and has also approached the state. It may be possible that they are also included in this pumping station. If they are, they will also pay a percentage share based upon their flow rates, which is good for us and good for you because it would lower the overall costs.
Well, is South Abington concerned at all that they're going to outgrow their station that we just built as a resident of South Abington? I'm wondering, like, is it gonna limit their growth? Yeah, I mean, is that gonna cap them out at how many homes?
No, we've already looked at the overall allocation. Again, probably the RWA, and I have on my computer, I can pull them up, but basically the RWA plant is running at less than half of its permitted capacity right now. If it's permitted for 5.7 million gallons, it's running at less than half of that. And it,
Extremely expensive lines because of dumping in the Lake Street.
Mhm.
That's why they had to go with the new system. I know they estimated the growth in the area, and that's how they decided how big that was going to be. So, adding another 172 EQs is significant.
so in answer to that is we will be going, so we have had those conversations both with South Abington Township and also with RWA relative to the capacity of both the township and the treatment plant to handle this flow. In terms of an order of magnitude, I think the current use at the plant, I believe, is something like 6,700 EDUs, and you're talking about an additional 172, and that 6,700 only represents half of their capacity. So there is a substantial amount of capacity still available at the plant. Having said that, I'm going to go into a long-winded explanation of something else. So why don't I take your question? I'm sorry.
For their current sewage now, and would it be feasible for them to tap into this as well?
You're talking about around Newton.
Around the state hospital, around the middle school?
So since this original agreement was signed with Newton Township in 1972, Newton Township has, and those properties have had the ability under this original agreement to make connection into the wastewater treatment plant. The plant has gotten to a point and the effluent limits have changed substantially enough that the plant really can't take any new users by its, in the condition that it's in right now. But since it was put in place in 1972 through today, no one has ever connected into that plant, nor has there ever been any request to make a connection into that plant. So it is not, other than this one developer that we are going to have conversations with as part of this project, there's not been anybody who's ever wanted to connect into that plant. Now, having said that, this process doesn't happen in a vacuum. In order for there to be a change in a sewage plan on this order of magnitude, you have to change what's called your Act 537 plan. And your Act 537 plan is a sewage facilities plan. Every municipality has an Act 537 sewage facilities plan. That plan determines and discusses how the sewage is handled within each municipality. So in order to implement this project, we have to work with Newton Township and DEP to modify their Act 537 plan. And that's a public process. We go through, we work with the township, we develop a plan amendment. That amendment is brought to the township. They put it up for public comment. It goes through a public comment period. It's approved by the township. Then it goes to DEP. DEP has to approve it. Then it gets published by the township. Then after it's approved, it goes to DEP. DEP then has to publish it. Again, it's available for public comment. So there's a whole process that goes behind just this issue of whether or not there are adjacent lands that can be serviced by the project that will come into this process. In addition to Newton Township, because we're taking sewage from Newton Township and connecting into South Abington Township, South Abington Township has to modify its Act 537 plan because South Abington Township flows through Clark Summit Borough. So Clark Summit Borough has to modify its 537 plan. So we will put all those plan amendments together and work with those municipalities to have them adopt this, and this is part of those costs that I was talking about before, that the state is going to incorporate into its project so that there's not a cost to these municipalities in developing those plans. But that would be the mechanism that an adjoiner would, approach the state and say, hey, I want to get in on this project. But recognize that there's no free ride here. The state is not going to, the state is not going to pay for a private developer for their share of the cost. They would have to come up with their share of the cost. If they come in and say, I want 10,000 gallons worth of sewage capacity, they're going to have to pay that construction cost, and they're going to be responsible for those fees to Arwa for that capacity amount.
I
Yes.
see. And what type,
Do you have some idea of the prorated portion of the cost that the school district's going to have to bear on this project?
Yes, and bear in mind, these are our estimates at this time. So what we are estimating is a capital cost upfront. And again, the agreements would spell that out, of approximately $1.1 million. The annual costs would be approximately $32,106, which would be a sewage fee that would be payable to South Abington Township.
What are we currently paying?
You currently pay approximately anywhere between $14,000 to $16,000 to the state.
So it's going to double our sewage costs.
It's going to probably more than double, because that cost does not include some of the operating costs for the pumping station, which is probably around $5,000.
Oh, wow.
So why hasn't, if you're going to spend a lot of money, why hasn't that been involved in the whole survey? The cost of it and why they haven't maintained that. So it sounds like we should have been all aboard. We're a third of the usage of that plant. We have not been involved in this at all.
Well, the original agreements, again, that go back to 74 with the township, place the entire operation and maintenance and operation of that plant is completely on the state. It's not, and your obligations under that plan are to pay a portion of the treatment fees for whatever they're doing. So they're not charging you for anything more than the operating costs. You really weren't, in one sense, actually ever paying a percentage of the original construction costs or any of the capital costs that were involved with that. I mean, really, the original numbers were substantially discounted.
That's not my question. I
Sure.
understand that. The question is, okay, now, is there some other things that we could have maintained that, put into maintenance every year to make sure that this doesn't occur, that now we have $1.1 million that we have to just pay out.
Yeah. So,
And an increase in companies.
yeah, a fair question. Treatment plants, like everything else, like your car, sort of have a life cycle. They get to a point where they reach the end of that life cycle, and no matter how well maintained they are over their lifetime, they get to a point where you need to look at replacing them. And in addition to that, you have increasingly stringent environmental effluent requirements. So what you were allowed to put into the water back in 1974 has substantially changed. So the technology, a trickling filter that you're using right now at that plant, is not going to be able to handle the types of BNR requirements that are coming and that are currently in effect. So
And that should have been upgraded going along. Those changes happened years ago. And nothing's done to help with that. So again, it's just another thing that we have a major capital cost here that we just find out about. That's a little disturbing.
I understand.
But we're going to be reimbursed for the initial capital cost, is what you said. Is that
No, no, no,
No,
no, no,
That's on
no,
us.
no.
correct?
No.
That's what, that's.
I know, wait,
that's
what
the
are we
agreement
being
says.
reimbursed? You said the state is going to be
No,
reimbursed?
the municipalities that, the entities that are involved up front for the agreements and the review of the project plans, that those costs are all going to be part of initial agreements. But you are going to have a responsibility for the capital costs and the operating, your share of the capital costs and your share of the operating costs.
That's what the
So-
motion
And
says.
that is going to happen whether we do a pumping station or whether we do a wastewater treatment plant. But the problem is the wastewater treatment plant alternatives are substantially more expensive.
So what would, could Abington Heights go on their own sewage?
Absolutely, if you
And-
want to.
And what would that mean and what would that cost us?
Well, that would have to be something that you would need to determine, but I would suspect that we've had those kinds of discussions. You're going to be looking at similar costs relative to the type of construction. Either you're going to have to build a wastewater treatment plant in Newton Township to handle the sewage flows from the schools, which if you look at your 1974 model, you decided was not cost effective compared to the alternative, putting in a pumping station and putting in a force main. That was your original plan back when Blaney and Kloss did the original plans for that site. So if that's the answer, then you've got two different entities that are side by side that are both putting in pumping station and both putting in force mains and essentially pumping to the same location. So from a cost standpoint, it's going to make more sense that those be done together and that those costs be shared. And again, the state has the same, motivation in that they are looking at trying to minimize the overall cost of the project. And that's so, in that sense, you're partnering up with somebody who's got the same objectives as you do. There are some possibilities that we've got, an adjoiner property owner who could make may have a flow similar to yours, in which case those costs will come down proportionally. So we're not counting on that at this point, but that would be something that would also happen.
What happens if after it's built and the cost, what happens if after it's built and the costs are invested? A big developer wants to do a project and plug into the system. Where do those funds go?
So there will be an Act 537 plan. That Act 537 plan will have a definitive boundary in terms of who can use this pumping station. So if they're not a part of that 537 plan and they don't step up this year and commit to the dollar amount to pay for their share of the plant, they will not be able to connect in the future. Because they won't be part of the plant and they wouldn't have not made any payment into it.
So nobody can plug into this after the fact, after it's
Correct.
built.
Correct.
But my question is, with like all the funding available for infrastructure, I know it's much different from a homeowner when you're, own something, a bigger entity. But why are we building our own pumping station? I would think that like the state, the federal government, somebody with the infrastructure funds would be responsible for sewage management and we would pay to hook up or something. Why are we owning a pumping station?
Well, in most cases, just like when Arwa built the plant, there are funding sources available, but eventually, most of those funding sources are loans. Like when Arwa built its plant, its biggest contributor was, I believe, a Penvest loan to help fund that, and they're paying that back, and you're paying that back through your user rates. So you're correct. If there were funds out there to build an infrastructure project, but they're not available for this particular project. If the school district identifies funds, either directly through itself or that might be available through the members of the school district, then they can apply those funds towards this project. So for example, LSA grant funding, something like that. But in order to do that, I don't believe a school district is directly eligible to do that. Only municipalities are. So that's the gambling money.
How much
So-
control do we have over the bidding process and who gets awarded the contracts and who controls? I mean, if we're gonna be paying part of this, I know whenever we do a project with the district, we are very careful on who we select for contractors, and we do competitive bidding and make sure, I mean, I don't like giving it $1.2 million and having no say whatsoever in who the contractors are, or how they've been bid, or who's managing the cost. What about overruns? Who's responsible for all of that? I mean, 1.2 million could turn into,
So
Exactly.
the project will be run by the Department of General Services. So, and I don't know if you've dealt with general services, but basically everything that gets built or bought within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, other than what PennDOT spends, is through general services. So all of the state buildings, I mean, all of the state hospital. Well, I'm just, well, flood control projects, everything goes through this process. So they actually have a very, it goes through an internal review process with general services through their engineers. It gets bid out through the state procurement process. It's a public bid. To the extent that you want to have some, and again, I'm not the lawyer, so, but to the extent that you want to have some review or input or acquiescence to that process, I think that would be something that could be captured in the agreement. As part of that, I think that would be something that they could do as part of that agreement. I know that when we've done this the other way around, where we did a wastewater treatment plant and the state was connecting a state prison into that project, they wanted that same right. So even though the local municipal authority was doing the project, the state wanted the right to look over those bids, but it was still the local municipality's project. But they, so I think you're just asking for that sort of a similar right to review. Yes.
I'd like to just revisit a comment you made earlier about we have the option of doing this ourselves, putting in our own wastewater treatment plant for the school, actually for 2 schools now.
Mhm.
And the cost might be in the same neighborhood or perhaps a little more. But in that particular case, we would be controlling the whole process and controlling the condition and the maintenance of the facility.
Yep. Right. I mean, so that process of trying to put a wastewater treatment plant out there has to go through a 537 planning process also. And one of the things that is going to come up in the 537 planning process is going to be DEP asking you whether or not you've looked at a regional solution to that problem. So it's not this, it's not necessarily this, Clark Summit State Hospital that is gonna, you're already, I don't say married to them, but you're already a partner with them in that sense. They are not forcing that partnership. If you believe that there's a better alternative for you, there's nothing that prevents you from pursuing that. But having done this, my career, I can tell you that goes through that same Act 537 process. You're going to wind up dealing with the township. The township is then going to be faced with the issue of, do they want to have a wastewater treatment plant there? You're going to wind up discharging into a small creek, which means it's going to be a wastewater dominated creek, which means that the effluent limits are pretty stringent. You wind up with a lot of the same kinds of problems that the hospital is facing in looking at a wastewater treatment plant alternative. And I think the ultimate decision would be that it's not cost effective. And on top of that, there's going to be this other process by both the municipality and by DEP that is going to basically force you to look at a regionalization alternative. Because they don't want to be managing and permitting more small plants.
I
Mike,
think
is this a
that makes
project
sense.
we would get reimbursed for from the state? You know how construction projects, we get reimbursed, we would not get any reimbursement for this?
The plan con has really dried up. It's
Really?
more-
Right.
So this is a very unusual thing we would certainly see funding. But Mr. Durkin, I have a question if I may.
Sure.
You put forth some pricing as far as cost,
Yes,
which would lead me to think that you already have some design in mind,
yes,
okay, of the facility.
yes,
Right. Now, you mentioned earlier that the state has set up a funding allocation for the
Correct.
project.
yes.
Now, if you design the project and there is an allocation, then to what extent does the allocation cover the project?
And I understand
Which is
that,
an
but,
alternative
but,
that's established.
but legally, the state cannot fund anything other than costs related to their own facility. So that means that if this is a $3 million construction project and you're a third of that usage of that you have to be responsible for that third. If you don't want to do that, then they'll just fund the project on their own and do their own project. So they cannot fund this. They're not going to fund, we talked about a possibility of another developer making connection to this system. They won't fund any of that either. That developer is going to have to provide his or her share of those funds up front in order for the state to allow them to be a part of this project. If Newton Township decides that they want to reserve a certain amount of capacity because they're interested in future development beyond this developer we just talked about, and they say, hey, we'd like to reserve an extra 40,000 gallons or something, or 10,000 gallons, they're going to have to pay for that up front. The state will not fund anything other than what the capacity that's necessary for them to provide sewer service for the state hospital.
If I can follow up on that point, right? That would make sense to me if the capacity of the plant was going to be increased if Abington Heights decides to sign up to this project. But the idea is apparently, it would seem, because you have a pricing, that the capacity is already built in there, and whether we're in or not, the state is paying for that capacity.
No,
No?
we will lower the capacity of that plant. If you were to say, hey, and again, let's just say you said, you know what, we have plans to shut down that whole campus. We're not interested. We're going to be done in a year. The state would not build any extra capacity into that plant. They would lower the capacity of the pumping station, the force mains. All of their planning, the Act 537 plan would be reduced to just their facility.
So currently, it's spec to include our capacity.
Correct.
You would have to redesign the thing to reduce the capacity if we don't put this.
Well, we have finished the study phase of the project. We've not gone into, we will be doing later on during this year, the actual physical design of the pumping station, the force mains, and all the permitting that goes into that. So you are included at this point in the study phase, because we're assuming that this is going to be the alternative that you want to pursue.
Right.
But we've not done the hard design of the buildings and the piping and sizing the pumps and that sort of thing yet.
And how about the source of that allocation? Is it an appropriation?
Yeah,
Is
it's an appropriation.
Did you mention that there was something in existence in Newton Township that nobody had yet ever hooked up to?
So,
What is that? And can we use
so the
that?
original agreement actually gave Newton Township, I believe it was 200,000 gallons of capacity in that plant. And so for several decades, that was available if some developer, residential, commercial, whatever, in the township wanted to make a connection into that plant. From a planning standpoint, from an Act 537 standpoint, that was available to them. Now, over the decades, that no longer is available because the plant would no longer be able to handle those kinds of flows. But I was saying that pointing towards the fact that there's really not been any connection or development for a very long time out there.
So is Newton Township going to get a refund on their investment?
They didn't have any investment. The
I
plant
thought you
was,
said they paid into or.
no,
for
no,
capacity.
no, they never
Well,
paid into it.
How'd they get capacity without paying? How do we do that?
Well, first you got to go back to 1974. Right, so that was the original, that was actually how you made connection into the plant, was under the original, that 1974 agreement, you made connection through Newton Township. So you were actually within Newton Township. You didn't become a signatory to the agreement until 2001, the second amendment of it. I mean, the school district itself actually signed on to the
So
agreement.
you're saying that this plant is going to be shut down that we're currently using?
Yeah.
And who has the authority to do that? The state has the authority to say that's it, it's shut down?
Well, again, it's a process. So right now, there's a 537 plan in place that says the sewage from the Clark Summit State Hospital and the sewage from the school district are being treated at that plant. So that's the 537 plan. For that to be changed, for there to be a different alternative for handling the sewage that's generated within the township, there has to be a change in the 537 plan. So part of this whole process will be to change that 537 plan.
But the state is initiating this action.
Yes,
The state has decided that the plant that we're currently using, that we're sharing with the state hospital, is no longer functioning to the level that they need it to, or it is functioning, but they fear that it will stop. What's prompting this right now?
so what's prompting this is there is pending changes to the permit, and there have been historical operational issues which the current technology can't handle in terms of meeting some of its effluent requirements. And there have been a number of studies at looking at whether or not the existing technology could do that. And there have been 2 or 3 studies, ours being the latest one, looking at technologies to replace that in order to meet those requirements. And so the answer is, it is functioning today under its current limits, but it is not going to continue to function at its current limits with its new, it's not going to continue to function.
And so basically what they want to do is get out of the business, send the problem to South Abington, so that in 30 years when South Abington has to get in the plant, that's their problem, not the state.
No, I do think they want to get out of the business of wastewater treatment. That's not what they do. I mean, no more than you would want to be doing it if you were running a wastewater treatment plant. You'd be thinking of the same thing as, how do I get out of running this business? This isn't what we're here to do. They run a hospital and they don't want to be in the business of treating wastewater. That being said, it is primarily and very much driven by a cost consideration. In other words, what we've done and the prior consultants have done is looked at the cost alternatives of making this connection into a regional wastewater treatment plant and comparing that to the cost of upgrading and replacing the existing wastewater treatment plant. So had those costs been flipped substantially in the other direction, and it was way more cost effective to keep the plant and replace it and upgrade it, then I think that's the alternative that they would be going in. But that's not the case. But I don't think it's fair to say they're making it somebody else's problem. The regional authority is in the business of treating wastewater. It has the capacity, and to the extent that there were ever in the future an upgrade to that plant, and there were costs, they would share in that cost the same as any other user.
Is that regional authority a private entity, or is that?
No,
that's public?
No, RWA is the Abington Regional Wastewater Authority. It is the entity that treats the sewage from Clark Screen, Clark Summit, and South Abington Township.
And it's
so
owned by the municipalities?
Those 3 municipalities are the entities that formed the regional authority, and that's what they they all have representatives on that board.
Gone up when they had to expand it and make corrections to it, and
No, I have a drainage field.
taxpayers pay. So,
Taxpayers pay due, yeah.
and part of that was because they were at over capacity and they were dumping into Leggett's Creek, and
Right.
we were getting fined. So that's what this whole thing is about.
So have you guys just determined what the timing is, if we don't do, if the state doesn't do anything, have you advised them on how much time is left for this facility, or is it really?
The state is
change.
going to do something. They are moving forward, and we expect, according to the current schedules, to be in construction in next year, 2022.
To your knowledge,
So-
if the state hospital is making any changes, are they gonna have a different capacity for this, or are they renovating it all?
No,
So, but my question wasn't
well,
that.
I'm sorry, I want to answer that completely. They are not changing their current capacity for patients at the state hospital. They are neither increasing it nor decreasing their capacity. We are, however, doing additional studies up there. Like this month, we will install sewage flow meters around their site, and also one on the line from the school that feeds the treatment plant, to look at those flows. Because remember, I said to you there was a split of 40,000, 20,000, and that's based on some prior metering and also estimates of flows. But we are redoing that. We're doing that, doing more of that. Plus, we are doing additional metering on their site because we have a concern about inflow and infiltration that's being generated from their site. So inflow and infiltration is additional water that gets mixed in with your sewer. So if you have a roof leader, or if you have an area drain that's connected into your sanitary sewer, when it rains, that water gets into your sanitary sewer system. So we know that there are I&I issues at that site. So part of what we're doing is we are doing an I&I study in order to identify those areas and separate out any sources of I&I that's going into the system. So, and that was why if you remember, at some point I said, we intend to demolish the plant, maybe completely. And the reason for that is, if at the end of all of their work on the I&I, it's still determined that they have some I&I issues, we will reutilize some of the tanks that are there as temporary holding tanks to make sure that we don't exceed any capacities. So if there's a big rainstorm and there's some extra water, we'll have a place, again, not from the school, but related to the hospital. We'll have a place to store that, and then we'll put that back into the system. None of those costs, anything that's like a cost similar to that's related to the I&I, none of those costs would be part of the shared costs. Those would be specifically assigned to the hospital.
Now, will you be doing those same testings to the district's lines?
Excuse me?
Will you be doing the same type of testing that you're doing with?
We are putting a meter on the district's
for
line
the
also.
district's line? Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
So timing wise, the capital cost of 1.1 or $1.2 million, you're looking at that, the school district covering that cost next year?
That, again, that would be spelled out in the agreements with the state in terms
But I
of
mean,
how that.
what's your sense of when the money would be required from a cash planning standpoint?
I'm guessing that, but generally they look to have their funds in place before they go forward with construction. But, given the situation with the school district and I have no idea what your financial status is, other than if it's like every other school district, a municipality, municipal authority I deal with, it's pretty tight. So I think they would
Probably
find
next year.
What?
Probably next year.
Yeah.
So when you're doing your studies, are you doing it over 12 months so that we have the reduced flow during the summer? You're not going to take like the last 3 months and then multiply that by 12, right? I mean.
So we do have to make some adjustments for that. And the answer is that is yes and no. So flows, when you're sizing a pump for a pumping station, you're basing that on your peak flows. So if you're in business 9 months out of the year, and then you're not in business for 3 months, well, I still have to build my pumps and my station and all of my equipment big enough to handle your flows when you're in business for those 9 months. So that still becomes the basis for our design flow.
But when you're doing the proportion, you're saying if they have their proportion of the total gallons going through, and whose percentage, our total gallons, if it's smaller, we would have less of the cost.
Correct.
So that would be our goal.
Correct. And again, this is part of, I think, the process where you would have your district engineer and your lawyer review eventually the agreements that would come in and look at these studies to understand those proportions and those agreements, and you would have to buy into that, or you would have to, make your argument that, hey, we think it'd be more fair to allocate this a different way. So I think that's there needs to be an agreement that talks about all of those things. That comes next. So that's kind of the next step, if you will, like all those details have to be hammered out to go forward with the project. And again, that's not just you, that's Clarkson McBorough, that's South Abington Township, that's Newton Township. And on top of all that, there's this planning process that has to go on.
So this whole plant was built, I don't know, built before middle school was built and tied into their system?
I think the original plant goes back to the 50s.
Okay, so we had nothing to do with the construction of it.
Correct.
But now because of it's obsolete, it's got to be rebuilt, now we have to pay a part of that capital investment. It's like, all we're doing is paying for service to use that plant. They own the plant, why do we have to then put 1.1 million into the plant? I mean, we just want to pay our sewer bill.
Right, but part of your sewer bill is in fact capital costs. Like if you were to dig down into your sewer bill or your water bill or your electric bill, there's a certain portion of that that has to do with the treatment of pumping the water out of the ground and treating it. But 80% of that cost has to do with all the piping and all the pumping station and all the tanks.
But we don't own that equipment, and we will never own that equipment.
Correct.
So it's like, why should we invest in that equipment?
Because we need,
Well,
we need to have sewers to the
But
building.
why wouldn't the
That's
state
why-
fund 100% of it and charge us a higher usage fee?
That's, like, I
You-
don't know the equipment down inside that township, they take care of my sewer bill went up because I'm paying.
Because,
Right, you're paying
and
for it.
right, but
And that's
the,
kind of thing I would want to do as a school district.
and again, I'm not the lawyer,
Right,
but
I understand. I apologize.
that's fine, but the money that was allocated for the project from the state is for the state's portion of that capital allocation. That's what they have money for. They don't have money for anything that's not related towards servicing the hospital.
But what
There's
happened,
not a piece of that that's allocated for Abington Heights School District or a piece of that that's allocated for South Abington Township or anybody else.
but when the state does a project for a municipality, a sewage system for a municipality, and they allocate new dollars for a complete redo of a system, they don't just take into consideration the city's usage of that, they consider the usage of the whole area that's currently using it, right? And then they just charge the residents. I mean, I'm a novice when it comes to this stuff, but I'm surprised that we're being asked as a
Yeah.
school district.
The state doesn't
Front this money.
the state doesn't replace sewer systems. The replacement of sewer systems and sewage treatment plants are a local responsibility.
Right, so the local municipality would have to fund 100% of it, you're
Yep.
saying, right?
So
Yeah,
if
I mean,
was
unless they
going-
go out and get a grant or they get a low interest loan. So that, which is typically how those kinds of projects are done.
If I was going to allocate the costs, I would look at what it would take to, there's certain costs that are going to be fixed regardless of the size of the plant. So if the state was going to only build one with the capacity of the state hospital, let's say, for instance, it's $4 million for that piece. And then we said, now we want you to expand it to add us. Well, that's not going to double it. It's like, because there are certain things that cost what they cost regardless of the size.
Yeah.
So if I were to see an allocation of the cost based on your calculation, I would want to see those upfront costs that are going to cost what they're going to cost, regardless of who, if it's
Sure.
just for the state. And I only want to see for Abington, the larger pipe has to be put in because now
Sure.
we have bigger.
So the difference is paying. So if you're, let's just, again, I think you hit it exactly correct. The current cost allocations are based upon the total flows and dividing up the cost of that project by the total flows. That has been the formula that the state
Well, I don't like
has.
that. It's not good
Right,
formula.
right. No, I know. I'm just telling you the way that it's calculated right now in the study.
Right.
what you're raising is saying, well, I just want to pay the incremental cost.
Exactly.
You state, figure out how much it's going to
Exactly.
cost you to do the project, then I'm going to come to you and say, I want 20,000 gallons of capacity. How much incrementally is that going to cost to make the pumps? To
Are there
go
any
from a
comps?
3 horsepower pump to a 5 horsepower pump, to go
Right.
from a 4-inch force main to a 6-inch force main? How much more, it's the incremental cost in providing that service? That is not how the costs have been figured and not how we've been directed to do it. I think that's a legitimate question for you to bring to the state as part of this conversation in the cost sharing arrangement.
Okay.
And also to make sure that third party is gonna be, if they're gonna be a player or not, that contractor. And
Yeah, that'll
make,
be small.
you know, add them
Yeah.
into it as
But,
well.
but if, but for, I think that we do have to look at the incremental cost, right? I mean,
I wonder if there's
Right.
any comps. I mean, have you ever done a project like this for another similar school district where there's anything remotely similar to this, like this?
We've done several projects where we've done regionalization, where we've eliminated treatment plants or pump, connected smaller systems into larger systems. So,
But anything with a school district?
trying to think, not that I remember a school district.
I think like things like permitting and land, like all of those costs are what they, they're gonna.
I understand your argument. I'm
Okay.
just,
I
I'm
wanna make
just,
sure.
yeah, no, I fully understand your argument and I'm writing my notes and I'm happy, I will report that back. So I fully appreciate
So
that.
what's the next step?
Mr. Durkin,
Sure.
Phil Robeson, I had a couple questions. One is, so for 1.1 million capital investment and 32,000 operating per year, and I'm assuming that doesn't include the prorated engineering, legal, project
No,
management.
those are all included.
Okay, so what do the taxpayer, what do we get? What value do we get?
Well,
Mr. Durkin,
what you get for that is you get sewage disposal.
okay, so nothing different than what we have today.
Correct.
All right, so then we talked about some alternatives. What's do nothing alternative? What happens?
Well, there is not a do nothing alternative. That's not really an alternative because the state is going to replace this plant or this pumping station. If you opt not to be a part of their project, you'll have to do something because there won't be a treatment plant to be connected.
So we don't
into.
have any rights.
So what's in the agreement today?
What's in the agreement today is that you had, well, actually what's in the agreement today, and I'd be happy to provide copies of it. What's in the agreement today is that you pay a certain amount based upon your operating costs. And if there's upgrades to the plant, then you will pay a proportionate share of those upgrades.
Okay, and when does that expire?
It has no expiration.
Okay. So there is something in place though.
Sure, if the alternative was to upgrade the plant, to replace the plant, you probably would not need a 537 plan update. Well, that's not true because the plant, you'd still wind up updating your 537 plan, but all of those other interactions with Arwa and South Abington Township, they would not come into play. Your original agreement would probably still be in play. And you would wind up funding, I think under the original agreement, you would probably wind up funding it through increased operating costs on an annual basis.
Right, which is different than what you're proposing.
Yeah, under this proposal, there won't be any plant, so there won't be any agreement related to the plant.
So
Right,
basically
so is that the
agreement-
driving factor, a modification of the 537, which deals with reserves?
Well, the 537, yeah, the 537 would get modified under either alternative for the reasons I've already spelled out for the pump station option. But even if there were a new plant, the 537 plan would get rewritten because the current 537 plan says that plant has 400,000 gallons of capacity. And there's no way we can permit that
Right, is the
for
537 the
40,000.
one that's driving the capital cost of a new?
No, what's driving the capital costs is the cost of replacing the plant. Maybe I'm not
But
clear.
that's determined by the state, not us. Like, we didn't decide that was you said you did net present value or
Yeah.
internal rate of return, and
Mhm.
you did all these, options, and this was the one. The best one that came out was Abington pays 1.1 million and 32,000.
The present worth analysis does not take into account who's paying what. The present worth analysis looks at the cost looks at the total project costs for each of the different alternatives and determines what the lowest present worth is of those alternatives. It doesn't slant the cost one way if it's better for the state or better for the school district or better for anybody else. It just looks at the total cost. It does not look at how those costs are allocated.
Okay, and that includes the useful life of each alternative and all that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then, so the do nothing is the current agreement. The one that you proposed is the 1.1 million and the 32,000 a year for current services as is, no increased capacity. And what's plan B? We do it ourselves?
And I'm not sure that you can get to that alternative because, again, no matter what happens, you got to go through a 537 planning process. And you trying to remember I can't remember if the school is completely in Newton Township. I don't know if you remember. So ultimately Newton Township is going to modify its 537 plan. And that is going to determine how sewage within the township is treated. And for them, for there to say be two pumping stations going in two different directions, they would have to approve that, and DEP would have to approve that. So, I mean, and I don't know that DGS, if you determine that you wanted to have your own treatment or either treatment plant or pumping station and handle that on your own, I don't think DGS cares. Like, that is fine with them. I think that the township may or may not care, and DEP will probably care. And those entities and the public all have to comment on that.
Have you ever
And-
spoken to Newton about all this?
Mhm.
Did they ever mention any intention of building a Newton sewage treatment plant?
They have no intention of getting any further involved in sewage treatment than they possibly have to.
But are they responsible to?
So they have a responsibility to manage their 537 planning process. And if out of that planning process comes that they have customers such as you or this new developer, they're going to have to manage that. They can do that without an authority. They can do it as a pass through, but they have some role in managing that. But I mean, they have not offered, and the state is not expecting that they'll take over the operation of this pumping station. The state would love that. The state would be perfectly happy if Newton Township took over the pumping station, took over the force mains, or South Abington or some public entity took them over and they just paid their annual sewer fees to them. They don't want to even operate this pump station, but they don't see that there's a feasible alternative to that other than them putting it in.
Okay, so what's our next step?
So then I just had a few more questions. So in looking at the risks, because the net present value is all financial, right?
Mhm.
What about the risks that go along with this, the proposal? I mean, I see many, one being DGS is running it. I mean, if there's any inefficiencies or delays, contingencies, does Abington Heights responsible for any of that, or is it a fixed fee thing?
Well, again, I think that would be part of your agreement, but generally when they do these things, they manage that under a certain budget, and there's language in there for underruns or overruns within the project budgets. I will say from our viewpoint, we do many, like 2/3 of our work is for public entities, and a vast majority of that is in sewage treatment and sewage transportation and pumping stations and force mains. I mean, we have a pretty good handle on what the bid costs for these kinds of things come in. But that having been said, you're correct. I mean, you never know what's under the ground till you turn it over.
No, but my question is, what are some of the risks outside of the financial ones?
Well, outside of purely financial risks, we always look in consolidation at environmental risks and at safety risks. And our, whenever we've analyzed that, we always come down on the side that bigger entities have more capacity to handle both of those kinds of risks, that they do more in-depth training, they have more backup people available, they have, in-house capabilities for confined space entry, for laboratory services. So we generally find that regionalization is from an environmental and safety standpoint is less risky. The other, if you're running your own treatment plant, and just as was referred to before, if you're in constant violation, you're subject to fines. Well, that may be an issue with a smaller plant, but it's not going to be the kind of issues you're going to run into with a larger plant.
Right, but the risk specific to this, this proposal.
Yeah.
That's all there is.
Well, I've got a lot of administration to try to work through, because there's a lot of entities like you guys, and this is not your job, and I really appreciate you taking all this time to go through this with me. But I know you have a lot of other things on your plate, and that's the same issue with all the other entities. It's a long process with a lot of pieces.
So most of the houses in Newton are on their own septic systems, correct? I mean, there's no public sewer per se in Newton.
No, the only sewer line is the line that runs from the school down to the treatment plant that the school district built. And that line, there was a court case over it a few years ago. And it was determined that line belongs to the school district. That's not a public line.
So there's no incentive for Newton Township to join RWA.
I would not think so, but that, that's not the model that we're talking about. There would be a separate agreement for them to purchase capacity from RWA as opposed to being a member of municipality. They have other than these two entities, this would be their only connection.
So good. Go ahead.
Have you had this conversation with the sewer authority?
Yes.
They're okay with everything?
Well, again, yes. So the short answer is yes. We've had these conversations, and everyone is in agreement, but no one has formally passed what I've gone to each municipality and each entity, the school district and the authority. Each one of them, I've gone through sort of the same sort of process of come to a work session. Let's talk about it. We want to understand it. You've thrown a lot at us on our plate, and we want to walk away and think about it.
So if anyone says no to it, then what happens?
Well, I think then we're going to have to regroup, and we'll have to understand, like what that particular issue is. We haven't identified anything that's an issue. We're not, and we're not aware. And again, we've been having these conversations for a while. We've not identified from either the municipalities or from RWA that anybody's got an issue with it. Again, there's lots of concerns over the details and those kinds of things, but nobody has an issue with the overall concept of where this is heading.
They can't unilaterally shut the plant down without we have a contract with them, right? So they can't just shut it down.
No, well,
Exactly what I was gonna ask.
no, I don't think that there can come a day where like you go to use the school and the pipes are all blocked. No, the answer to that is no. I mean, again, this is a whole process. It involves lots of people, lots of planning. And there's nothing that's going to happen instantaneously or against anybody's will. But there is a very real cost reality behind these numbers in terms of what alternative is really the most cost effective. And I think that's really what's going to drive
We need to
this.
sharpen our pencils a little bit, right?
Yes,
Appropriation that you mentioned before, how much is it?
I believe it's $4 million,
Okay,
although I'd have to actually check that.
right. And now, if we're a third of the cost, and our cost is 1.1 million,
Mhm.
then we're looking at maybe 3.5 million for the project.
It's actually closer to 4 because remember, there were other costs that I,
So far, right? So the appropriation, and what is the source of the appropriation?
it's a capital appropriation from the legislature
Okay,
that allocated this money for DGS to spend for Clark Summit to upgrade its treatment plant.
okay. So the money is there to do the project. It's in the appropriation.
Correct.
And are we saying the legislature is going to go back and reduce the appropriation by $1 million?
Yes, if it's not, they're not going to reduce it, but whatever's not spent out of an appropriation returns to the general fund.
And so, but the appropriation is there
Correct.
for the sufficient capacity to construct this pumping station to include Abington Heights.
No,
Well, if the appropriation is 4 million
correct,
and we're at 1,
correct.
that's a third, and it gets to
Correct.
4, and that's equal to the appropriation, then what am I missing?
Well, I think what you're missing is that the appropriation is to cover the costs related to the hospital and nobody else.
So where is the?
What's the
where's
total cost? I think we don't have the total cost. What's the
Well,
total? Because from what I understood, there were certain costs that they were gonna pick up on their own.
No, there are certain costs.
Where's 1.1 million come from?
So that's basically 4 million less the other costs that are related to I or the treatment plant portions of that being kept in place. When you take those out, then those are split 2/3, 1/3, the remaining portions.
And so what is the process for that $1.1 million to go back to the general services?
It happens automatically when they don't spend it. If there's money left over from an appropriation, it just automatically reverts back to. It's reserved right now in the capital budget.
Right. And so you would say the money is there in the appropriation. It's not, we are going to have to, Abington Heights is not involved. Therefore, we're going to redesign the plant in order to get that money back into the till, so to speak.
No, I mean, if we wound up going with one of the wastewater treatment plant, you have to remember, these appropriations don't come out. These appropriations are done years in advance of what we're doing now.
Right.
So one of the one of the alternatives was upgrading the wastewater treatment plant. So if they had to spend $4 million to upgrade the treatment plant, and that's all they did was upgrade the treatment plant, then like that alternative is, say that's a $5.5 million alternative. They would still be coming back to you and they might be funding $4 million of that, but
But they're not
another
doing
million.
that. There's an appropriation equal to the cost of the project.
I understand what you're saying, but that appropriation, just like in your budgeting, when you put something in a category, maybe you have the ability to move it around between categories. With respect to the state, when it's appropriated by the legislature to be utilized for the wastewater treatment plant for the hospital, that's all it can be used on. It can't be used outside of that use. It's not legal for them to use it on anything else. Excuse me?
Who owns the wastewater?
I think it's technically owned by, it's all owned by the state. I think it's technically owned by the Department of Human Services.
So they need to replace the wastewater treatment. No matter what goes in there, they need to replace it. So that's where the money should come.
So they want to replace it.
Well,
I don't know if they.
and if our costs go up on yearly to help benefit, but that's, because
Well,
we don't own it. We don't have any part, but you want capital money from us to pay for it. That's the problem I'm having.
Well, in any utility system, a user pays a proportionate share of the fixed costs. When you just like the sewer fee you pay to Arwa, or you pay whatever municipality you live in, you pay an annual or you pay a quarterly sewer fee. You are paying for those capital costs.
Yeah, but it's not that we don't put that money in the plan.
But,
Right.
Well, yeah, we're gonna. we are
but
going
I
round
think,
and round.
I think the reality is, if you had an increased allocation over the useful life of this, if it's 20 years or whatever, it's gonna be $1.1 million or more when you add in the interest. I mean, I think really what we're saying here is it's $1.1 million next year, which we may end up having a bond issue for or something, so that our, in fact, increased allocation is the debt service to that bond or whatever.
Capital investment, are we gonna own?
The problem is we have no control, over the
Well,
investment. We have
I
no
think,
choice.
I think we are in the very early stages, and I think we have a lot of negotiating to do, and I think we have to sharpen our pencils, and I think that we can rework the way some of this is being calculated and allocated to the district
Mhm.
before we can even entertain this motion.
Sure.
So I don't know, so what's our next step?
Well, I mean, I will certainly, I'm gonna take your concerns back to general services and make them understand where you're at. I still, our next step with all the involved individuals is we are trying to get some, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in the wording that I've provided to you. It can certainly be wordsmithed and adjusted the way that you feel comfortable. That's not the agreement. That there has to be an agreement, with all of the specific details that comes after this. This is just a general indication that, that the entity involved is okay with the concept of where this is heading. And that's what we're doing with everybody. That wording can come in any form you want, but that's still our next step with everybody.
The problem I have with the motion is though that it basically commits us to a portion of the cost.
Yeah, we're not doing a motion now.
No,
This
and,
isn't
and,
happening.
and I don't, and it's not intended to do that. So I think that it's not an agreement, and I think that you should reword it in any way that you're comfortable.
Well, let's find out some of the answers to some of the
Sure.
questions that we had tonight, and then
Sure.
we'll revisit it.
I'm going to leave some cards here.
Would you come back after all this?
Oh, sure, all the time.
Yeah, okay.
Listen.
Yes, because maybe we'll have you.
That would be wonderful.
Are you an Abington resident?
Yes.
I'm actually a resident of West Pittston, although I
Okay.
spent
Delaware.
Susquehanna, yeah. So I spent most of my life, I said I grew up behind Our Lady of Peace School, so
Okay.
I went there, so.
All right.
Anything else? Again, some cards here. I think someone has my cell phone number.
I think we have.
Okay, so if you need to contact me or email me, and I'll be happy to respond to you and give you my cell phone number, and we can have conversations as long as you would like offline. I'm happy to talk about, I love to talk about sewage. I could do this all night, really, I could. No,
There's so many lines.
yes, Tom is my brother, yeah. Yeah, Tom, Margot, and my sister is Marcy, so,
Okay.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now I understand. Well, I don't think we want to tell too many old stories.
Yeah.
All right.
right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
I will.
Dr. Mann, don't we have a partnership with the state hospital with the gas lines that we put in?
Trying to remember. I think we tried to get them to pay and they wouldn't.
Right,
Ironically,
right.
so,
Yeah.
yeah. uh,
Yeah. So we are on to, okay, we are on to public comment. I don't know if there is anyone with us still after all that. If there's anyone who wishes to address the board.
I'm seeing no hands.
No hands.
No hands.
I'm surprised. Nobody wants to talk sewage.
Yeah. So that's all. Nobody's interested.
Okay, do we have any action discussion items this evening? No, none? Public comment is over. That's it. We have a motion to adjourn? Okay. All right, thank you. And we have an executive session.
We do.